Okay, good afternoon. I hope we are all safe and healthy. First of all, I would like to thank the Asian Qualitative Research Association for this very kind invitation to talk about the topic, which I could say is very close to my heart. First of all, I would like to say that there's no one way of doing discourse analysis, now that it's no longer just a subfield of linguistics and communication studies, as I will talk about later. But before we begin, let me point out my biases. My approach to discourse analysis comes from my training on linguistic ethnography and critical discourse analysis. For those of you who may not be familiar with these terms, these are approaches to studying language in society primarily focused on unmasking social inequalities where language has roles to play. I organized this talk into 5 parts. First, I'll talk a bit about what discourse analysis is, and crucial here is what we mean by discourse to begin with. Next, I discuss the typical ways on how we can analyze discourse. Where can we start? What frameworks can we use? And the typical approaches to doing discourse analysis or DA. I will then offer some points as to why analyzing discourse matters. And after this, I will speak briefly about one chapter from my dissertation where I talk about the discursive construction of the home away from home by Filipino migrant workers in Hong Kong. And then finally, I end my talk by saying a bit about what discourse can and cannot do. Okay, so how did discourse analysis emerge as a field of study? Discourse analysis started as an area of interest within linguistics some 60 years ago, but it has developed into a discipline of its own when interest in discourse analysis spread to other disciplines within the humanities and the social sciences, such as, for example, in sociology, anthropology, communication studies, cultural studies, political science, psychology, and many others. In turn, those who do discourse analysis has also borrowed theoretical and empirical insights from these other disciplines, making it truly an interdisciplinary field of study. The intellectual climate that spread across different social scientific disciplines, where language became the optic for understanding certain social phenomena, have come to be called the discursive or linguistic turn. I may not be able to cover it in its entirety, discourse analysis, as a field of study due to the limited time we have, but maybe by identifying what we actually mean by discourse may provide us some insights on how we can train our senses into the investigation of certain discourses. We have to understand that when people speak or write, they simultaneously say something, do something, and are something. Or fundamentally, according to philosopher John Austin, speaking is doing. Words are actions. In that, for example, when the president of a university declares conferment of the degree of graduating students, the students then become members of a profession, are given the right to enjoy the privileges enjoyed by those belonging to the profession. That professional circle is an example of what discourse analyst James Paul G calls the Big D discourse. These are social groupings that have some recognizable ways of saying things, doing, and being. We are socialized into it by means of training or by being part of a certain group. The recognizable ways of saying and doing is what G calls the small d discourses. It's a stretch of language use we may be able to relate directly to larger social practices. This is why, according to G, in discourse analysis, reading the word requires reading the world. How one conveys meaning is built upon a system of choices, according to M.A.K. Holliday, another linguist. And these choices reflect how we understand worlds and our position in those worlds. The way we frame our messages reflect our alignment or disalignment with particular worldviews. And this is the stuff that we analyze, the worldviews. the ideologies or systems of beliefs with which we consciously or unconsciously follow or resist. When I first encountered discourse analysis, I have been told that DA is the study of language structures that are larger than the sentence. This means that we are not after the grammatical or the formation of sounds into words and the combination of words into comprehensible sentences. It is something larger than that. It presupposes that there is a larger structure that governs these linguistic formations. But this does not mean that we dismiss these linguistic formations. For Jan Renkema, DA investigates the relationship between form and function, not just form, but the potential meanings that these forms create. It is a study of language in use. The thing is, when we produce utterances or sentences, we don't just do it randomly, right? There are certain ways of speaking and writing that are understandable to some, but may not be so for others, given certain conditions of telling or writing. So for Rodney Jones, we have to look into how sentences and utterances are put together and how the texts and interactions fit into our social worlds. And I wish to emphasize the plurality there, social worlds. This is why some say that it is not only the study of language in use, but a study that covers matters beyond language use. And so I go by this definition by Adam Yavursky and Nick Coupland. Discourse, according to Yavursky and Coupland, is language use relative to social, political, and cultural formations. It is language reflecting social order, but also language shaping social order and shaping individuals' interactions with society. So, in a sense, discourse is what we make of it through our words and actions, while at the same time, it is what emerges from our words and actions. Analysis of discourse is the analysis of language use, the micro, in order to understand larger social, political, and cultural formation, the macro. But exactly how do we analyze discourse? Yavursky and Coupland say we can look into structures of conversation, stories and various forms of written text, subtleties of implied meanings, and how language in the form of speech interacts with non-linguistic or, for example, uh, visual and spatial communication. Now you may ask, is discourse analysis always concerned with written or spoken text? Not necessarily. Language as we know it is not the sole container, it's not the only container of meaning in human communication, because meaning making is done in multiple modes, not just linguistic, but by means of images, gestures, movements, and others. Now, where can we start then? You may wish to ask yourself these questions. What am I interested in? What kinds of data do I have access to? And what is going on here? What's going on around me? Discourse is everywhere. When we look closely at things, we may realize that certain things seem to be repeated and in systematic or patterned ways. The first step is noticing patterns. Before I got interested on investigating language and labor migration, I was first fascinated by just how much my family and circle of friends give value to working abroad. How did the idea of leaving for work abroad become a yardstick for socio-economic mobility in the country? So, in a sense, I noticed this discourse of overseas work as a one-way ticket to socio-economic mobility. Though I mentioned earlier that there's no one way of doing DA, there are frameworks nonetheless that are used more than others, one of which is Norman Fairclough's framework. So Fairclough's framework is based on Michael Alexander Kirkwood Halliday's systemic functional grammar. And Halliday says that when we use language, we do three things at once. First, we represent our experience in the world, the ideational metafunction. We negotiate a relationship with people, the interpersonal metafunction. And we join ideas together in particular cohesive and coherent way, the textual metafunction. The analysis of text covers traditional forms of linguistic analysis, that is, analysis of the sound system, words, sentence structure, and others, as well as how sentences are connected together and how the whole text is organized. Discourse practice refers to institutional routines, such as procedures in producing media text, and it covers transformations that texts undergo in their production and consumption, acknowledging the interpretative processes in the analysis. And then finally, the sociocultural practice, as you can see in the diagram, covers the wide frame of society and culture that may be concerned with power and ideology, as well as value and identity. So together, they reveal the social relations and struggles echoed in a discourse sample, which is the text we're trying to analyze. Fairclough offers three corresponding stages of analysis. Description of the text is the first one, which, for example, we would ask questions like, what are the actual words that were used in the text? Interpretation, where we could ask questions like, what seems to be the effect just by the use of that one word over another? And what does it do in the text? And then finally, explanation. How may we, how can we relate the use of that word to larger social structures or contexts within which such word is uttered or written? I discuss Fairclough here more than others because I find this a bit more straightforward in how we can go about the analysis. But please note that this framework is not without problems. One criticism may be that it can be a bit restrictive in its use of the Hallidayan linguistics, which is often criticized for being too structuralist for an intellectual climate that veers. The intellectual climate now veers more towards postmodernism. But there are different ways that we can do DA, not just the Fairclough, the framework of Fairclough. And so these include, and I enumerate them here: conversation analysis, discursive psychology, ethnography of communication, interactional social linguistics, narrative analysis, genre analysis, corpus assisted discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, mediated discourse analysis, and multimodal discourse analysis, among many others. I'm listing them here in case you may be interested in further exploring these approaches. And as I mentioned earlier, for example, that discourse analysis is not necessarily always just the analysis of language as we know it, but also the many modes of communication alongside language, like images, gestures, and actions. These are the stuff of multimodal and mediated discourse analysis. Now we come to one very important question. Why do we analyze discourse? Why do we have to do it? I wish to invoke here the point of Del Hymes, a linguistic anthropologist. According to him, discourse ultimately cannot change the inequalities that make it rational for centers and margins of power alike to combine in ecological destruction. But discourse is everywhere, and scrutiny of our own and that of others is a lens that may sometimes focus light enough to illuminate and even to start a fire. Let's take a look at the headlines from 3 online news reports on the hazing incident in Quezon Province in 2014. Journalists, editors, and contributors, according to Tino, are free to use words and expressions, language style, and linguistic structures in their articles. Their linguistic choices reflect their ideological position on an issue, and because of the power of the media to reach a wide audience, Van Dijk claims that media has the ability to reinforce ideologies, reproduce public opinion, and by extension, construct and constitute the discourse on certain issues or matters. In reference to these notions, it is worth noting these headlines. And here I come to ask, what do these headlines say about hazing? How do these headlines construct the discourse of hazing? So let's take a look at these headlines. And the headlines say, ex-student ng SLSU patay sa hinihinalang hazing sa Quezon. Another headline says, which also directly translates into English as ex-student dies after hazing in Quezon, and ex-student dies after alleged hazing in Quezon. These headlines place the attribute of the victim, that is, a former student, in the subject position of the headlines, as if exclusively associating hazing as a crime that may happen solely to individuals who are students of a school or university, and creating the impression also that if the victim is not a student, an incident of hazing may not be considered as hazing. But Republic Act 8049, or the anti-hazing law in the Philippines, states that hazing may also happen to any individual, not necessarily a student, who wishes to be part of a fraternity, sorority, or organization. Note that the student was actually no longer enrolled at SLSU when it happened, and that it happened outside of campus premises or school term. With the headlines framed this way, hazing is discursively constructed as a problem confined only within schools or universities, and not a similar problem and responsibility of other sectors of society. Ironically, the group who are allegedly responsible for the incident were never mentioned in the headlines nor the leads. These are the most important parts of a news report. It gives the impression that hazing just happens and that someone just dies because of it. So, in a way, it agentivizes hazing as an entity in and of itself that can inflict danger to people. This is problematic in the sense that we erase the culprits out of the picture. What I discussed is an example of critical discourse analysis. Okay, CDA is sort of a forensic activity with a libertarian political slant. Its goal is not just to find out what sort of discourses are apparent in a text, but ultimately to unmask social inequalities. It investigates problem in society left unnoticed otherwise. One of the ways in which we do CDA is captured in the screenshot of a tweet that you can see in your screens. Always ask yourself the questions: who writes the stories, who benefits from the stories, and who is missing from the stories. If we would compare, for example, how historians framed one historical event, we would get different stories. American historians, for example, who have strong American nationalist bend, might have framed through discourse the American colonization as they always do, benevolent assimilation, while Filipino nationalists would frame it as nothing but oppressive imperialism. You might want to check from your textbooks or modules of your children at home just how one topic is framed. Say, for example, what it means to be a man or a woman, because it would reveal a certain worldview, a discourse that may be enabling or restricting for our kids. At this point, allow me to share a part of my research on Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong. This is one chapter from my dissertation where I investigate the notions about home and how this may be related to their transnational migration experience. So in 2017, I've done ethnographic fieldwork in Hong Kong, particularly during Sundays, where I joined our kababayans, our fellow Filipinos, who are mostly hired as domestic workers, spending their day off from work in the Central District of Hong Kong. You may already be aware of this image of Filipinos resting and doing various activities in Central in Hong Kong, which have been featured in news reports, documentaries, and movies. In my participation in various activities with them, I've always wondered why they would rather stay there, usually under in hospitable weather conditions. And there's one response I consistently receive: this is our home away from home. And so I went to investigate this matter by asking these questions. How is home discursively articulated and performatively enacted in recurring practices? What do these practices say about Sunday and Central with regard to the homing experience of Filipino migrant workers there? Just to give you a brief background, foreign domestic workers in Hong Kong should live in with their employers. Legally, they cannot buy a house in Hong Kong. After termination or expiration of contract, they are required to leave Hong Kong within 2 weeks. They are given one day off from work, usually Sundays, and based on earlier studies, Central has become a favorite place to spend their day off since the 1980s because it is close to institutions that cater to migrant Filipinos like government, church, and commercial centers for remittances and purchases of Filipino products and services. Now, during my field work, I've noted at least three practices. First is they group together based on the places or of their origin in the Philippines. They use flattened out cardboard boxes as border and picnic mat, and they name their hangout spots, their tambayan. An informal survey I carried out with the assistance of social activists who regularly conduct outreach activities in all areas of Sunday Central generated a consolidated map indicating typical locations of specific ethno-linguistic groupings. We can see in this figure the presence of four main language-based groupings, which are Tagalog and a mix of other speakers of other languages, um, uh, pure Tagalog speakers, Ilocano, and Visayan speakers. And here, this is one sample of my recorded interaction with one of the groups that I participated in. When I mentioned about how much I long for Sundays because it makes me feel good, Sonia, not her real name, responds by saying that it makes someone feel at home, further elaborating by saying it's like you're in the Philippines. This is a common response I receive. Home is the Philippines. The gatherings at Central feels like home. It makes them feel like they are in the Philippines. Then I wondered, why do the gatherings make them feel like they are in the Philippines? Here's another extract from my recordings where I asked Rachel, not her real name, about how she feels whether whenever she's in a company of fellow Ilocano speakers. Rachel responds that she forgets about her homesickness, that she feels that she's not alone because she's in the company of familiar others. In this sense, Sunday Central transforms into a site where memories of home become both a source of remembering, as when being within the earshot of fellow Ilocano speakers invokes a sense of being home, and a means of forgetting certain emotional burdens like homesickness, although temporarily. Group names, as you can see in the photos, hanged or unfolded next to the tambayan or the hangout spots, do not only point to the existence of the group, but more importantly, signal the group's ownership of the place where the name is displayed. Naming in Austin's sense, under socially acceptable conditions, is a performative act of bringing something or someone into being. For Yi Fu Tuan, and I quote, naming is power, end of quote. Because when naming a place, and I quote again, the proper name and a geographical feature so merge in the consciousness of the people who know both that to change the name is to change the feature itself. End of quote. So naming a space in Sunday Central as one group's own is arguably an exercise of power over such space, an assertion of one's autonomy in using a certain place according to one's needs and tastes, and in expressing oneself inside it, the hallmarks of what it means to be home, albeit in this context, not out of the public gaze and judgment. In so doing, Such space is reordered at least once every week from being part of Hong Kong's financial, business, and government center for the most part of the week into a space of control for Filipino migrant workers akin to homemaking. Okay, so in this extract, we can see how temporary cardboard structures built and rebuilt every Sunday are endowed with both pragmatic and effective values, which are typically associated with physical homes and the social process of homemaking. You can take a look at certain lines here, like line 24, where Daisy said something about the place as being their land with title, and this is emphasized in a loud voice. And in line 31, where she also said something about squatters, you cannot squat here. In line 51, she said something about the fence. We put a fence around it. And when I had this conversation with them, it was raining back then, and then suddenly, so this is from line 60. Suddenly, they pointed me to another direction, where they said that um, the house of a neighbor is flooded because their house, those temporary flattened out cardboard boxes, are in a place, in a space at the HSBC tower there, where there's no covering. So that's where they said, poor thing, those who are outside, their house have been flooded again. So the lexical choices of the participants here make it clear that it's part of the process of homemaking. Lupa, land, titulo, land title, squatter or squatters, kabila, bakod, which is fence, and ultimately bahay or house. It is clear that in this context, the cardboard boxes are in what Idima calls it's resemitized from its original function into one that allows them to assert possession for what is otherwise a space that is open to the public. The regular use of the cardboard box by FDWs congregating in Sunday Central imbues it with meanings that likewise depart from its original purpose. In this context, it is made to become an important material basis for community building and arguably by extension, their homing experience. Overall, Sunday Central thus emerged as a home away from home through discursive practices akin to homemaking, such as ethno-linguistic grouping, naming, use of flattened out cardboard boxes transformed into a makeshift home. While this is reflective of the Filipino migrant workers there, of the homing experience of our fellow Filipinos there, for easing out in a foreign country, which reflects their adaptation and integration strategies, the recurring practices are also symptomatic of the wider social and political conditions that constrain efforts toward full social integration. And these include, the immigration laws, accommodation arrangements in relation to their employment. But it is here that so-called what I would call Little Philippines emerges from what Raymond Williams might call the structure of feeling home at Sunday Central. Structures of feeling, according to Williams, pertains to meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt that emerge from practical consciousness towards an articulation of presence. It can be said that the nexus of migration and home, in this instance of transnational labor migration, lies at the crossroads of Sunday Central, both literally and figuratively, where homes are envisioned, felt, lived, and discursively made. For being transformed as the nexus of home and migration, Sunday Central manifests as an in between space where FDWs feel, articulate, and collectively build a sense of being at home, while not completely at home, at least just yet. As a final point, we may ask, what are the things that discourse analysis can and cannot do? So, discourse analysis is a committedly qualitative orientation to linguistic and social understanding. And as such, it inherits both the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research. One would be on the justification of the selection of data. Discourse analysis are, discourse analysts are often accused of cherry picking or choosing only the data that seem to fit the theory, argument, or if I may borrow from the discourse of positivist research, the hypothesis set out prior to the conduct of the research. This is why it is increasingly be this is why it is increasingly being supported by approaches from other research traditions. To avoid criticisms on cherry picking, many DA studies have employed the big data approach to collection and interpretation of data. This is what is now called the corpus assisted, corpus informed, or corpus based discourse analysis. Here, analysts derive arguments from patterns in large scale data, which are collected and collated into a corpus. And then from this corpus, we get discourse samples representing the general point or argument we get from the corpus. However, we must not forget that DA is designed for analyzing local, single cases rather than large scale ones. It was not designed to answer questions about large scale social differences or social change, although again, because of technological advancements that allow us to collect large scale data, we may now be able to track social differences and social change through DA. One simple example of this is the Google Ngram tool. So using the Ngram tool, we may be able to trace the history of the use of a single term from the corpus of text that were scanned by Google, and this is an incredibly large set of data. As a final point, I wish to emphasize that despite the new developments in discourse analysis, we must never lose sight of the fact that its power is on its explanatory and critical depth. That is, we pull together disparate units of information and systematically put them together into a coherent form that reveals certain aspects about our social life that may not be that may be left unnoticed otherwise. And with that, I end this talk. Thank you very much for your attention.